The early morning fog hung heavy over the snow-dusted plains of Eastern Europe, curling around the hulks of abandoned equipment like ghostly fingers, and through the mist rolled a column of German Panzer tanks, steel behemoths meant to strike fear into any Allied soldier. Yet on this morning, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded these machines for years began to fracture, because in the distance, a single unseen shell streaked silently across the frozen landscape, moving faster than any I could follow, a projectile so unnatural that when it struck the lead Tiger, there was no conventional explosion. No shrapnel, no telltale smoke plume, only a clean, horrifying incision through the thick armor, as if the tank had been made of wax, paper, or some fragile, impossible substance. And the crew inside had barely time to register the unnatural sound, a faint hiss, like wind through a narrow tube, before the entire compartment lit up in a blinding heat that left instruments melted, steel warped but not shattered, and men screaming in panic, unable to comprehend the impossible destruction. While outside, German officers froze mid-step, staring in disbelief at the gaping wound, their rigid discipline dissolving into paralyzed horror, because the shell had done something that no Allied weapon had ever achieved. Something that violated every known law of ballistics, metallurgy, and warfare. And as whispers spread through the ranks, the word witchcraft began to echo among soldiers, first in hushed tones, and then in outright fear. Because no engineer, no ordnance specialist, no veteran of 1,000 battlefields could explain what they were witnessing. A single round passing through Tiger and Panther, tanks with surgical precision, leaving intact armor around the edges, killing crews instantly without a single fragment of debris to trace, and yet leaving the machine structurally compromised. A terrifying paradox of destruction that should have been impossible, and the psychological impact rippled immediately through every echelon of command. From the panicked crewmen crawling from the wreckage to the commanders in distant headquarters who received scrambled radio messages describing the devastation, the unnatural speed, the absolute clean penetration, and the untraceable nature of the shell. And as the engineers attempted to reconstruct the scene, they discovered something even more unsettling. The projectile seemed to interact with the metal itself in a way that suggested some energy or force beyond traditional physics, almost as if it ignored the steel, passing through as if the armor had no substance at all. And the implications terrified them, because if this weapon could be replicated, or even accidentally occur again, the entire doctrine of armored warfare was obsolete. Every Tiger and Panther reduced to vulnerable scrap, and the commanders realized that they were not just witnessing a new weapon. They were staring at the possible collapse of a carefully constructed symbol of German military power. A tool that had been revered as invincible, now rendered mortal in a single, inexplicable strike. And yet the fear did not end with mere observation, because surviving crews reported side effects that no engineer could explain. Strange heat sensations running through the hull, instruments warping without impact, a deafening silence that followed immediately after the strike. And some even claimed to see faint glowing trails along the path of the shell, disappearing moments later as if the projectile had been guided by some invisible hand. And as the field reports came in, the term witchcraft became widespread, not as superstition, but as a desperate attempt to describe something entirely beyond human understanding, a weapon that defied conventional logic. And as the High Command convened emergency meetings in Berlin, with generals pacing in shock, scientists scribbling frantic notes on blackboards filled with calculations that refused to reconcile with the observed phenomenon, and intelligence officers scouring captured Allied materials for any hint of experimental technology, the sense of dread escalated, because the evidence pointed to one terrifying possibility: that the Allies had either discovered a physical principle unknown to German science, or developed a round so advanced that even the finest minds of the Reich could not predict. And if that was true, then no tank, no fortress, no defensive line was safe, and every plan, every strategy, every investment in armored supremacy was instantly called into question. And as the story unfolded further, whispers spread among soldiers of ghost rounds passing silently through tanks, leaving death without damage, and men began refusing to enter the battlefield. Engineers began documenting failures in secret, and commanders hesitated to commit their forces, paralyzed by fear of the unknown. And the mystery of this shell grew even more intense when survivors described not just physical destruction, but psychological terror. The sensation that some invisible intelligence had selected its target, striking with unerring accuracy, leaving nothing but a frozen landscape and shattered human lives in its wake. And as we move forward into the next point, the suspense will escalate further, revealing the first attempts by German engineers to replicate, reverse engineer, and counter this witchcraft shell, and why every effort only deepened the terror, proving that the battlefield had suddenly become a theater of the impossible, a place where men and machines alike were confronted with forces beyond comprehension, and where survival would depend not on skill, courage, or planning, but on the mercy of something that appeared, vanished, and left behind only fear, uncertainty, and a lingering question that would haunt every soldier and officer who ever faced the ghostly projectile. What if the shell they called witchcraft was only the beginning, the first hint of a weapon that would change the rules of war forever? And the only certainty left was that no one, no matter their rank or experience, would ever look at a German tank the same way again. As the reports of the ghostly shell rippled through the ranks, German commanders convened in hastily assembled tents, maps sprawled across wooden tables, faces pale under the flickering light of oil lamps. And every officer present knew that the stakes had suddenly escalated beyond mere battlefield losses into something that threatened the very foundation of their armored doctrine. Because the destruction they had witnessed was not just mechanical, not just a matter of firepower versus armor, but a phenomenon that defied every calculation, every precedent, every principle of warfare they had trained their entire lives to trust. And as Major Weber traced his trembling finger along the route the Tiger had taken, pausing at the precise point where the projectile had struck, his mind raced through ballistic equations, armor thickness tables, and historical performance data, none of which could account for what he had seen. And as he spoke aloud, trying to frame a logical explanation, the room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the canvas walls and the muffled sob of a junior officer had witnessed the death of his entire crew. And the theories began to flow. Some whispered about advanced Allied Sabah rounds, others about experimental propulsion systems that could accelerate a shell beyond conventional velocity, and a few, more superstitious, or perhaps more honest, suggested the unthinkable, that the shell was not merely a weapon but a force of nature, a singular anomaly, a curse of the battlefield. And the word witchcraft slipped from their lips more than once, a desperate label for the incomprehensible. Because the psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction, and as intelligence officers compiled field reports, sketches, and survivor testimonies, they began to notice patterns that made the hair on their necks stand on end. Every strike followed the same impossible trajectory. Every penetration left the same surgical smooth wound. Every Tiger hit showed the same internal anomalies: melting instruments, warping steel, and a subtle heat signature that no thermodynamics model could explain. And the commanders realized with mounting horror that they were not dealing with a freak accident, but with something that could appear again at any moment, anywhere, on any front, targeting their heaviest, most heavily armored vehicles with unerring precision. And as word spread to other panzer divisions, crews began to hesitate before entering combat. Tanks moved slower, commanders second-guessed every deployment, and morale began to erode quietly, insidiously, because fear of the unknown is more potent than any artillery barrage. And every soldier on the Eastern Front knew that what they were seeing could not be countered by training, skill, or numbers. And so, the High Command ordered secret experimental teams to reverse engineer the event, assembling engineers, metallurgists, physicists, and ordnance experts to examine the wreckage, to measure every millimeter of penetration, every curve, every thermal anomaly. And yet every analysis produced only frustration, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. Because nothing in the Reich's scientific knowledge could reproduce the effects, nothing could predict them, and nothing could defend against them. And while these technical teams argued and tested, the ghostly weapon continued to haunt reports from the front. with eyewitness accounts growing more detailed and more horrifying. Crewmen described the projectile, appearing almost invisible, moving silently through air, leaving a faint shimmering afterimage, a whisper of light that vanished as suddenly as it arrived, and soldiers swore that some invisible force seemed to guide it, striking with a precision that no human hand could achieve, and in a chilling echo. Some officers even reported seeing the same effect on lighter vehicles and fortifications, not just on Tigers, leading to the terrifying hypothesis that the shell's effect was indiscriminate, unstoppable, and entirely unpredictable. And as fear mounted, the High Command began to suppress information, sealing reports, forbidding the use of the term witchcraft in official documents, demanding that survivors remain silent, but the whispers could not be contained, because terror has a way of spreading faster than orders. And soon, the legend of the ghost shell was on every front, haunting officers and soldiers alike, reshaping strategy, instilling doubt, and forcing commanders to ask questions that no one could answer. How does one fight an enemy that defies the rules of physics, of warfare, of reality itself? And as night fell over the encampments, the silhouette of abandoned tanks and shattered vehicles served as a grim reminder that even the most powerful machines could be obliterated by forces beyond comprehension. And as the cameras of this story would follow the next chapters, the viewer will see the human cost of this mystery, the psychological collapse, the desperate experiments, the frantic attempts to replicate the impossible, and the growing realization that the battlefield had changed forever, that the shadow of this ghostly shell was more than metal and fire. It was a force that undermined courage, shattered doctrine, and forced every soldier and officer to confront the terrifying possibility that they were no longer masters of war, but participants in a game with rules they could not understand. And as we move to the next point, the suspense escalates further, because the Germans' attempts to recreate, study, and counter the shell only revealed deeper mysteries, anomalies they could neither explain nor contain, and a sense of inevitable doom that would hang over every armored unit for the remainder of the conflict. As the investigations deepened, German engineers and ordnance experts were dispatched to makeshift laboratories set up in hidden bunkers, their faces gaunt from sleepless nights and the crushing weight of fear, because every test, every calculation, every attempt to recreate the ghostly shell only produced frustration and terror. And as they examined the wreckage of the Tiger tanks, measuring the perfectly clean holes, testing the twisted instruments, and analyzing the melted steel that somehow had warped without breaking, they began to notice anomalies so baffling that some of the older scientists whispered that no human mind was meant to comprehend such forces. And reports circulated of instruments detecting faint residual energy, of metal that seemed to shimmer with invisible heat, and of the crew's accounts that could not be reconciled with physics, because survivors described the shell's passage as instantaneous, silent, and invisible, yet leaving behind a destructive trail that obliterated both machinery and morale. And the more they studied, the more the engineers realized that conventional explanations, propellant composition, armor-piercing mechanics, sabot rounds fell short, failing to account for the smoothness, the precision, and the apparent energy signature that lingered in the air. And as these scientific teams debated feverishly, commanders watched the front lines with growing dread, because the same witchcraft shell had appeared on multiple fronts, hitting Panther tanks, anti-tank emplacements, and sometimes even artillery positions, always leaving the same impossible pattern. And the soldiers who witnessed these events were left traumatized, some refusing to enter their vehicles, others recounting hallucinations of shimmering trails, ghostly lights, and a feeling of invisible force that pressed on their bodies like a hand from the beyond. And as the fear spread, entire units began delaying movements, abandoning positions, or retreating without orders, because the psychological terror of facing an unseen, unstoppable, perfectly precise weapon was more powerful than any barrage of bullets or shells. And the High Command, desperate to maintain control, implemented strict secrecy, threatening officers with court-martial if they mentioned the phenomenon. Yet the very act of trying to suppress it only amplified the tension, because whispers traveled faster than orders, and soon, across multiple battlefronts. Soldiers told the same stories: ghostly shells that moved with impossible speed, penetrated thickest armor as if it were paper, left crews dead or unconscious, and vanished without trace. And the realization sank in that the weapon was not bound by human convention, not predictable by ballistics tables, and not vulnerable to countermeasures. And as the engineers pushed themselves to exhaustion, they experimented with alloy composition, shell design, firing angles, and velocity. But every attempt to replicate the effect failed catastrophically, producing nothing but shattered shells, warped test tanks, and growing frustration. And in the midst of these failures, a few brave officers proposed a hypothesis so radical it bordered on madness: that the shell's destructive power might not be purely mechanical, that some combination of heat, energy, and anomalous physics had aligned perfectly during the battlefield events, producing an effect that could never be reproduced intentionally. And while most scoffed at the idea, the evidence was undeniable, because no mechanical explanation could account for the uniformity of the damage across multiple incidents, the precision, the complete lack of fragmentation, and the profound fear it instilled in soldiers. And as word of these experiments leaked in whispers to the front, morale continued to erode. Tanks were abandoned in the field, and officers found themselves grappling with a terrifying truth that a single, unexplained projectile could change the course of battle, not by destruction alone, but by breaking the spirit, discipline, and confidence of their forces. And as we continue into the next point, the story grows even more suspenseful because the phenomenon escalates. Reports of the ghost shell increase in frequency. Soldiers begin to speculate wildly about supernatural intervention, secret technology, and enemy experimentation, and the viewer is left on the edge of their seat, witnessing not just the physical devastation, but the psychological collapse, the frantic scientific efforts, and the creeping fear that the battlefield itself had become a place where logic, rules, and human skill were no longer enough to guarantee survival, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and inexplicable chapters of the war yet to come. As the front lines became a theater of fear and confusion, the German soldiers who had once trusted in the impenetrability of their Tiger and Panther tanks now moved through the snow-covered battlefields with a sense of dread that hung heavier than the winter fog. Because the ghostly shell they had come to call Witchcraft was no longer a singular anomaly, but an unpredictable force, striking without warning, obliterating tanks in a manner that defied everything they had been trained to anticipate. And as entire units witnessed the effects firsthand, panic began to spread. Quietly at first, in hesitant glances, whispered warnings, and the subtle hesitation to enter vehicles, but soon escalating to outright terror, with some crews abandoning their tanks mid-combat, soldiers freezing at the sound of distant artillery, convinced that another invisible, unstoppable projectile was about to strike. And the stories they recounted were more bizarre and horrifying with each retelling. Shells that appeared almost invisible until the moment of impact, passing through engines, fuel tanks, and crew compartments without scattering fragments, without the familiar concussion, without leaving scorch marks, as if reality itself had been suspended for the instant of destruction. And when survivors emerged from the wreckage, they described sensations no one could rationally explain: sudden waves of heat that left metal glowing internally, instruments warping as if touched by fire, and a pressure so intense it felt like the very air had been cleaved in half. And as word of these events reached the commanders and engineers, the stress within the German high command became almost unbearable, because every field report reinforced the terrifying consistency of the ghost shell's effect. Every new incident proving that this was no accident, no lucky strike, no experimental weapon that could be analyzed or countered with traditional tactics. And the intelligence officers who tried to document the phenomenon found themselves questioning the limits of science itself, as calculations, metallurgical analyses, and ballistics models failed to match the observed reality, while simultaneously, the soldiers on the ground began to see patterns that only deepened their terror. The shell seemed selective, appearing at moments of maximum vulnerability, striking tanks that led assaults, destroying vehicles that carried key supplies, and somehow evading defensive fire, leaving the impression that it possessed a form of awareness. And this psychological weight was as lethal as the shell itself, because fear spread faster than the projectile, undermining confidence, fracturing units, and causing hesitation at critical moments. And as engineers continued their frantic tests, attempting to replicate the shell under controlled conditions, they were met only with catastrophic failure, as the slightest variation in angle velocity or material composition destroyed the experimental rounds or produced nothing, proving that the ghostly effect was not reproducible, not predictable, not even understandable by the most brilliant minds in the Reich. And amidst this mounting pressure, a few desperate theorists proposed radical explanations that bordered on the fantastical magnetic anomalies, undiscovered chemical reactions, even rudimentary speculation about energy forms beyond contemporary physics. And while most dismissed these ideas as implausible, the evidence of repeated incidents forced grudging consideration, leaving officers and scientists alike with a profound, unsettling sense of helplessness, because they were facing a weapon or a phenomenon that could strike without warning, evade prediction, and obliterate Germany's most prized armored machines with surgical precision. And as the narrative of these events unfolded across multiple theaters of war, the psychological impact multiplied, spreading through the ranks like wildfire, affecting morale, operational planning, and the ability of units to respond to threats. And as this point of the story reaches its chilling climax, viewers witness not just mechanical destruction, but the unraveling of discipline, the paralysis of commanders, the haunting testimonies of soldiers, and the relentless march of fear and uncertainty that accompanied every ghostly strike, leaving everyone who faced it questioning whether any tank, any strategy, any weapon could withstand the next inexplicable, unstoppable shell that seemed to arrive from nowhere, at any moment, leaving behind only devastation, terror, and the lingering, suffocating impression that the battlefield itself had been transformed into a place where human skill, courage, and planning were no longer enough to guarantee survival. And the suspense, the mystery, and the horror continue to build as we move into the next point, where the true scale of the ghost shell's effect and the desperate German attempts to understand it will escalate even further, pushing men and machines to the brink of comprehension and endurance. As the phenomenon of the ghost shell spread across multiple fronts, German commanders found themselves in an escalating nightmare, where every decision carried the weight of uncertainty, and the battlefield itself seemed to conspire against them, because the shell did not merely destroy tanks, it shattered confidence, disrupted formations, and instilled a creeping paralysis that even the most disciplined officers struggled to overcome. And reports from the Eastern Front detailed how entire platoons froze in the open, soldiers refusing to advance into zones where previous ghost strikes had occurred, trembling as they recalled the almost supernatural precision with which the weapon had struck. And while some attempted to rationalize the events as experimental Allied technology, the repeated pattern of destruction, the perfect clean cuts through the thickest armor, the absence of debris, and the lingering energy effects inside the tanks defied every conventional explanation. And as German engineers raced to replicate the shell, they faced catastrophic failures at every turn. Test rounds exploded prematurely, armor mock-ups warped unpredictably, and measurements of velocity, pressure, and thermal dynamics offered no insight, leaving the technical teams exhausted, frustrated, and haunted by the knowledge that the weapon that terrified their troops could not be countered or understood. And in the field, soldiers whispered of lights, shadows, and faint shimmering streaks cutting across the sky, invisible until the moment of impact, and the psychological terror intensified, as men feared not just for their lives but for the very idea of survival, knowing that no amount of training, courage, or armor could guarantee safety, and commanders were forced to revise operational strategies on the fly, diverting movements, holding back reserves, and in some cases, abandoning objectives entirely, because the unpredictability of the shell rendered traditional tactics obsolete. And while scientists debated theories ranging from ultra-high velocity, Sabah rounds to unknown chemical interactions to inexplicable physical phenomena. The soldiers who witnessed the devastation firsthand began to question whether they were facing a weapon at all, or some force beyond human comprehension. A curse that defied logic, reason, and even the laws of physics. And as the months progressed, the pattern of destruction became impossible to ignore. Tigers, Panthers, and even lighter vehicles fell victim, often without warning, leaving behind no fragments, no shrapnel, and no conventional evidence, only the haunting scene of mangled steel and lifeless crews. And the German High Command, desperate to maintain morale, attempted to suppress reports, enforce silence, and classify investigations. Yet the stories spread regardless, whispered from camp to camp, front to front, creating a collective dread that undermined discipline and haunted every decision. And in these desperate months, officers documented something even more disturbing. The psychological effects on crews were as deadly as the shell itself, causing hallucinations, panic, hesitation, and even outright mutiny in isolated cases, as men refused to enter tanks, fearing the invisible predator that could strike at any moment. And as the engineers continued their futile experiments, the ghost shell remained an enigma, eluding every attempt at replication. Every formula, every controlled firing, proving conclusively that this was not a mere weapon, but a phenomenon, unpredictable, unstoppable, and terrifyingly precise. And as the stories converge, viewers are drawn into the human element of fear and desperation, seeing how the ghost shell did not merely destroy metal, but shattered morale, strategy, and the sense of control that soldiers and commanders once relied upon, leaving a battlefield haunted not by ghosts of men, but by the phantom energy of a shell that seemed almost alive in its deadly intent. And as this point closes, the suspense reaches a fever pitch, setting the stage for the final climactic point where the full scale of the ghost shell's impact, the desperate measures of the German High Command, and the ultimate unresolved mystery of its origin will converge in a chilling finale that will leave viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about war, technology, and the terrifying unknown that lurks just beyond the edge of understanding. As the war raged on and the ghostly shell continued to defy comprehension, the German High Command faced an unprecedented crisis, because the repeated strikes against Tigers, Panthers, and even reinforced fortifications revealed a terrifying truth. The battlefield had changed in ways that no soldier, commander, or scientist could fully grasp. And as reports accumulated, officers struggled to maintain order. Morale collapsed in the field, and every attempt to recreate, counter, or even understand the shell failed, leaving engineers exhausted, soldiers traumatized, and commanders paralyzed with fear. And the more the experts studied the wreckage, the more bizarre the phenomenon became. Because instruments melted without heat, steel warped without shattering. Trajectories remained perfectly straight regardless of angle. And faint energy signatures lingered in the wreckage that no theory of ballistics or physics could explain. And as the High Command debated the nature of the weapon in secret bunkers, some proposed that it was a new Allied superweapon. Others whispered of experimental technology beyond human comprehension, and a few even dared to suggest that it was something supernatural, something that bent the very rules of reality. And while the term witchcraft spread through the ranks as a desperate label for the incomprehensible, the terror in the field escalated because soldiers began to anticipate the strike, to fear the invisible predator that could kill without warning. And entire units hesitated to engage, abandon objectives, or retreat under the looming threat of destruction. And as the months dragged on, the shell appeared with increasing frequency in reports, always leaving the same perfect surgical wounds, always defying replication, always shattering both steel and human confidence. And the psychological toll was profound, because men swore they saw the shell before it struck, a faint shimmering trace in the air, moving faster than thought, as if guided by an intelligence beyond human grasp. And commanders realized that no strategy could mitigate the risk, no armor could prevent the damage. And every plan hinged on uncertainty and fear. And in this final chapter, the viewer witnesses the full scale of chaos, desperation, and bewilderment. From laboratories where engineers failed repeatedly to the front lines where soldiers cowered. From officer councils debating impossible phenomena to survivors recounting moments of terror that would haunt them forever. And yet, even as this story reaches its climax, the ultimate mystery remains unresolved, because decades later, the classified archives hint at further incidents, at additional unexplained strikes, at faint records suggesting that the shell was not a single anomaly, but part of a recurring pattern. And as the screen begins to fade to black,